I want to deal with some comments. S Limited 1000 says, do you advocate boots on the ground and planes in the air? The quick answer to that is no. N14N1YF5F. It sounds like a Wi-Fi code. Do you advocate to just stand still while somebody breaks into your house, kills your kids, and blames you for it all? No. I advocate effective defence, and I think I'd be fairly clear about it. We mustn't fall for the paltering of Putin, especially when the man himself has, since October 2023, been encased in an ice block within the Smeg fridge. His mortal remains quietly chilling while the Kremlin finances an increasingly unconvincing cabal of doppelgangers. I'm Putin! This kind of theatrical devotion to Putinistas might well play out well in a Hollywood film like Spartacus, but in the reality of Moscow, the stunt doubles still need a paycheck and plastic surgery. And more importantly, NATO needs a plan. So first, we need to begin with an unflinching principle. NATO must shore up its eastern flank. Not because we seek war, no sensible person does, but because peace, paradoxically, is best secured when your adversary believes that war is unwinnable. The Baltic states, Poland and Romania all face increasing threats from Russian hybrid warfare. Already, disinformation, cyber attacks, and the infamous little green men who one day turn up in unmarked fatigues and start taking orders from the nearest FSB handler, whether this is poisoning people in the park or whether this is paramilitary activity in the corner of the Donbass. It's the same sort of thing, and it needs to be deterred. Russia's continued titubation toward, that's a sort of Frankie Howard word. Ooh, titubate not. Ooh, I don't want any titubation here. Russia's continued titubation towards further conflict requires a deterrent, a titubation deterrent. And the NATO response force, the NRF, was expanded to 300,000 troops in 2022. Yet we must ask, where are they? Where are they? Ooh, they're all titubating on their own. In theory, they exist, but in reality, their deployment remains sluggish, bound by logistical inertia. And if Moscow smells indecision, and it does, it will press the advantage. Now, to Ukraine itself. What it needs is an Iron Dome of its own, a layered, integrated air defence system that can repel Russian missile attacks and prevent the aerial devastation seen in Mariupol, in Kharkiv, and in Odessa. Because without this, Russia will march through Ukraine into Moldova, Belarus will join it, and then there's nothing to stop it taking the Baltic states, and suddenly we're back to a Russian empire that has the limits that the USSR had before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Israel's Iron Dome has intercepted 90% of incoming missiles and drones. Why? Because the investment was made. By contrast, Ukraine, as of late 2023, still struggled with shortages of air defence missiles, with its Patriot systems only sporadically reinforced because the US in Washington were dithering about whether or not to let them have what they'd promised. Historically, air defence wins wars. Consider Britain's investments in radar and the RAF's fighter command in 1940. Without it, the Battle of Britain would have been a short-lived disaster. Or take the Cold War. NATO's air defence umbrella over West Germany deterred Soviet incursions not because of a love of paperwork, but because no Soviet pilot fancied testing the effectiveness of American and British surface-to-air systems. Ukraine's manpower is not the issue. It has hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops. The issue is whether its skies remain vulnerable. An Iron Dome-style system, funded and supplied by NATO, is the only practical way to secure its cities and its military infrastructure while maintaining the West's principle of no NATO boots on the ground. Now, some call for NATO troops directly in Ukraine. It's folly. Firstly, because Article 5 exists to protect NATO members, not to drag them into a war they didn't sign up for. Secondly, because such a move would hand the Kremlin the perfect propaganda coup. See, the West has invaded. Never mind that Moscow had been the actual invader since 2014, since 2013, since 2012. It depends whether or not you pay attention to the paramilitary activity in Donbass. Instead, let's take inspiration from the historical strategic deployments that deterred rather than provoked war. Consider the Berlin airlift of 1948, an operation that kept the city supplied while avoiding direct military engagement, or the deployment of American advisors and technology to Taiwan in the 1950s, ensuring that the Chinese Communist Party never dared a full invasion there. The point? Western presence can be meaningful without being overtly militaristic, and it's rare in this context that one must give Donald Trump credit for strategic thinking, but there we are. His suggestion that Western companies, particularly American mineral prospectors, should be working in Ukraine is, in principle, quite sound. Why? Because economic activity in war zones stabilizes those zones. If Western firms, backed by private security and operating under international law, begin extracting minerals in Ukrainian-controlled territory, including Donbass, Russia faces a dilemma: escalate into an active war with Western interests on the ground, or accept the new status quo and pocket the money offered. We've seen this play out before. In the Falklands, when British investment post-1982 made any Argentine re-invasion absurd. West Germany, the economic integration made Soviet interference riskier. South Korea, the American investment deterred North Korean aggression. Of course, none of this works unless Ukraine has a credible defensive shield in place of its own. No miner wants to work under the shadow of a potential cruise missile or one of Putin's enormous threats. Ooh, I'm going to send one of my big what was it, Hawthorne missiles at you. That brings us back to the Iron Dome, doesn't it? Let's be blunt. A proper Iron Dome for Ukraine, combined with enhanced NATO troop deployments along the alliance's existing borders, that's Poland, Romania, Finland now, would cost billions. But compare that to the alternative. The war in Afghanistan cost the US over $2.3 trillion. The Iraq war cost $1.9 trillion. Ukraine has received, I think, $200 billion in Western military aid since 2022, a fraction of what was spent on these ridiculous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that delivered far less strategic benefit. A strong Ukraine costs less than a NATO intervention in a failed Ukraine. It's as simple as that. If Trump wants peace, and Trump is a president who, in his first term, didn't start any wars. That was rare for an American president. He didn't start any wars. He wants peace. If he wants peace, he has to invest in peace. So let's address the inevitable, the idea of negotiating with Russia. Some say we need a diplomatic settlement. That's what Trump is looking for. A peace agreement, something watertight. But watertight agreements with the Kremlin have all the durability of a damp paper towel. If you're going to use a damp paper towel, don't expect to flush. What we need is to look at history. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for assurances from Russia, the UK, and the US that its sovereignty would be respected, and that document aged like milk. The Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 that Zelensky pointed out needed to be renegotiated. These supposed ceasefires that were nothing more than strategic pauses while Russia regrouped and while its paramilitaries were ever active in Donbass, in that region of eastern Ukraine. If we must negotiate, the only remotely viable approach is one backed up by an unassailable military deterrent, one that makes renewed aggression too costly for Russia to contemplate. Otherwise, we are simply wasting ink. The war will not end with a handshake and a photo op. It will end when Russia realizes further escalation is untenable. That means a reinforced NATO border, because deterrence has always been the most effective way to prevent war. An Iron Dome for Ukraine, because securing the skies is the best defense against Russian missile barrages. Strategic economic investment, because Western investment in Ukraine, particularly in contested areas, makes deterrence through presence. And more than that, that strategic economic investment has to expand into Russia as well. A sceptical approach to peace deals, which is perhaps the most important thing, because Moscow has demonstrated time and time again that it views agreements as mere formalities to be discarded at will. And if we place too much emphasis on a peace deal with Moscow, which we know will not work, that cheapens any peace deal with any other country in future. Put simply, there is no path to peace that doesn't involve preparation. Russia will not be cajoled into compliance. It must be made to understand that any further aggression will result in strategic failure, and that's not by saber rattling from the West. We don't have the sabers to rattle, and anyway, you don't present peace by looking more warlike, by promoting war. You present peace by promoting the alternative that might be war, by looking into the future and saying, this is what you get if you don't accept the peace. But you can't force somebody at gunpoint to sign a peace document. That's the Minsk agreements all over. So we must not titubate, that word again, titubate, towards peace like some naive diplomat from a 19th century novel, or like some tipsy individual. We must march towards it with the full weight of military preparation behind us, knowing that we don't have to use it. We must march towards peace with the knowledge that Ukraine is fully defended and has and that we have invested in that defense. That's not a defense for Ukraine alone, that's the defense for the whole world. We need to set a standard. And making sure no one opens the Smeg fridge in Moscow anytime soon is the direction we have. Opening the Smeg fridge is a disaster. Turn the Smeg fridge into a coffin, bury him, and let's start again. Let's hope that the next president of Russia will be significantly more constrained, more circumspect. We want a president who is circumspect and who is who is aware of his place in history, rather than a president who has his eye on his neighbor's goods. President Putin's time has gone. A new president needs to be elected in Russia. The great and the good can gather in the Red Square for Putin's funeral. It's time to acknowledge that Putin died in October 2023. It's time to have that funeral. It's time to turn the page. It's time to put up an iron dome around Ukraine. It's time to put soldiers on guard at the borders of NATO. And that, I'm afraid, is the only way forward.